Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about developer relations, or developer evangelism, or I guess sometimes developer marketing. We're going to talk about developer outreach, what it is, why you might want to get into it, and then if you do want to get into it, we'll look at maybe how you could get started. I'm here today with
Bruce Lawson, and I used to be developer relations for Opera, the web browser people, until last year, and now I'm working with Wix on kind of developer outreach mixed in with a little bit of product development, but for something that's not released yet. So I'm going to speak about it in sketchy and obscure, mysterious tones.
I assume our listeners as well would just assume that it's crimes.
Similar.
I think the big question that we should open up with is, what is developer relations? What are you talking about?
Well, what is developer relations? It's different for every company. With Opera and with Wix, they are big consumer brands, but it's not consumer marketing at all. That's an entirely different discipline. But Wix and Opera, they needed to make sure that developers knew what they did. Many different reasons for that. With Opera, for example, because we were relatively small market share in developed nations where most websites are made. Part of it was to make sure that developers tested their stuff in Opera, because we might have had huge market share in Indonesia or India, but very little market share in Silicon Valley, which meant that we were often overlooked. With Wix, although it's a consumer brand, and please do not email me to complain about the pre-roll adverts on YouTube. That's nothing to do with me. I've never even met the people who make it, honestly. But although they have 100 million consumers who are actually people who make websites on their platform, they do a great deal of stuff in the open source community.
Okay.
Working with them on some new stuff. And for them, I don't think this is particularly secret, for them, like many other large organizations, when you're hiring developers, it isn't always on the money you can offer. It's about the kudos of the organization. So if you have a good reputation in the open source world, if you're known as a good player in open source, people want to work for you. And of course, there's incredible competition for high-end developers.
So developer relations is really about someone being hired who's really aiming to make sure that developers know about either this product or this company for adoption or for testing or for hiring purposes.
Yes. And the organizational reasons for hiring somebody to do DevRel vary probably from organization to organization. With Opera, it was very much making sure that sites are tested so they work properly for consumers, so the consumer end of the business goes well. For Wix, it's more about getting a good name in the developer community. Without spilling too many secrets, they're anxious that the stuff that we release makes good, semantic, valid code and adheres to the spirit of web standards. We're kind of extending some web stuff, but we want to make sure that we extend it in a way that isn't antithetical to the purpose of HTML and CSS, that it goes along with perhaps future versions of those specs. So I'm liaising a lot with people in the CSS working group, the HTML working group, etc. But why people hire for DevRel and what you actually do are...
So that's what I was going to tackle. Here's your purview, do this thing, go talk to developers, make them understand X. Having worked in developer relations myself, I understand that asking someone, what does an average day look like to you, can be a hard one. What might an average week look like?
Well, the average day can change. With Wix, because it's an unreleased product, I spend a lot of time helping the documentation team write docs. I don't write the docs myself because we have dedicated documentation people working with the people making the software to say, does that API really make sense? Or they ask me, does this API make sense? And I might go and look at competing or similar products and see what they do.
So this is kind of advocacy on the side, both of the product and for developers who are going to be interacting with the product in the future.
Yeah, because if you have a crappy API, people will be put off. With Opera, where it was a mature product out there, they contacted me and basically offered me the DevRel job, and we can go into the reasons why if you're interested later. But they, I think, envisaged it as a broadcast role. I would go and say, hey, look at what we've done, and everyone would go, woo!
So sort of, and we could touch on this a moment if you'd like to. A lot of people talk about developer relations or evangelism, sort of a more evangelist role, something where it's a sort of one-to-many broadcasting the word of Opera.
Yeah, but I was never particularly comfortable with the word evangelist. For one thing, whenever we advertised a job, we get lots of Christians applying, think it was some kind of missionary gig, which made for amusing reading, but got old pretty fast. But I personally am not a salesman. I never evangelized product. I was evangelizing open web standards. And of course, I would demo in Opera products, and I would explain to people in Silicon Valley why Opera mattered when millions and millions of people in emerging economies use it, even if you, Mr. As a Silicon Valley person, have never heard of us. But I was always advocating open standards, so I kind of arabesqued my job title into open standards advocate.
That's not a bad job title.
I felt more comfortable with it because I can't sell. I'm not interested in selling. I once had a telemarketing job for 3 days, which I found utterly soul-crushing.
Did it end badly?
Oh, I never made a sale because I felt sorry for the people I was ringing up and cold calling. So, yes, your employer might regard you as broadcasting the word of them, but I realised early on that a lot of my role was to feed back from developers to my employers. What was wrong with the products? Because sometimes people would say, I tested a new product and this didn't work. And sometimes people would say, I tested a new product and by the way, this bit of UI is crap. They've noticed it, and I would feed it back. And it went well. And towards the end of that employment, there was a team, I think the peak size of the team was 12, and we ended up at 5 or 6. And the people who wrote the software would every quarter email us and say, what standard should we focus on for the next quarter? Because we were the people talking to developers. Because people who write browsers write C++. They don't actually write websites. They may have a hobby website, but they're actually C++ programmers. So they're not particularly connected to the people who write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we were. One of the things I did is 2011, it was conference season in the autumn or the fall for any American listeners, and for you, Jessica. And every conference, people told me they had trouble with responsive images. And in the end, I slightly hungoverly wrote a blog post in which I suggested the picture element. And cleverer people than me took it on, and people from developer relations in Firefox and Chrome. We worked together, not skunkworks. It was part of our job, but it wasn't, official Chrome, Opera, Firefox collaboration. It was just interested people, and eventually got it into the HTML spec, and now it's in all browsers because developers needed it. Your question was, what does an average week look like? I could have been, inventing the picture element. I was almost certainly writing a talk for something. I might have been flying out to give a talk. I might have been looking at a press release, because my employers were Norwegian and I'm a native speaker, so I'd help look at press releases and try and de-bullshitify them as much as possible. But when you work for PR, it's kind of impossible to completely de-bullshitify stuff. And also advising our PR people, because our PR people were great, but they weren't necessarily technical. So they would say, what's our opinion on net neutrality and why? And I'd come up with
that sounds like a fantastic conversation to have with PR.
Yeah. It's like, in the end, I would have like a page on the internal wiki of talking points and what we think and why. And nearly always I was making them up because the PR people didn't know enough to have an opinion. And after 8 years of employment, I knew enough about the DNA of the organisation, if you like, in order that I could usually make an opinion which I figured wouldn't be too controversial internally.
So we've heard that developer relations can involve traveling, speaking, working with PR, working with technical teams, feeding back information from developers. And having spoken to a number of other teams, there does seem to be this beautiful wide variety in what developer outreach folks do. If I was asking you to I'm brand new off the street, I've never heard of developer relations before, how would you pitch the job to me? How would you be like, this is fantastic, here's why?
I would say do not do this job if you're the kind of person who demands to be able to focus on one thing for hours and hours, days and days. Because you might be deep in writing and researching a talk and your PR people ring up and say, oh my God, Apple's just done this, or one of our VPs insulted Flash has happened. The phones are metaphorically buzzing. What do we say? And you have to be able to switch mode very quickly. And you have to be a little bit markety, a little bit showbiz, and also a little bit technical. But it's the kind of job where you need to have a broad vision rather than narrowing down on one particular minutiae of tech. I mean, if you are an absolute genius on SVG and video codecs, and you can do all the show busy stuff and the PR stuff, good on you, but you can earn more money as a technician than a DevRel person.
So it sounds like this is a fantastic job for multitasking hams who like to get involved in a wide range of things.
Yes, and you have to deeply understand the business of the organisation you're DevRelling. And for me personally, you have to really believe in the product and what they're doing. But maybe that's just me. I'm not a salesman. I couldn't sell something that I don't believe in. But advocating open standards was entirely my thing. You know, I would do that even if people didn't pay me. And that's how I got into the DevRel job with Opera, because I was doing it unpaid anyway. And they said, would you like to make this your full-time job? And I went, yeah.
That's a really interesting point. How did you get into developer relations in the first place?
Maybe it was right time, right place. When I came back to the UK from living in the Far East, I got a job with a company not far from here in Birmingham called Rox Press, and they made computer manuals, computer books. And the boss, this is 2002, the boss said, you know, we have these books for designers. It's all about Flash and Photoshop. And we have these books for coders. It's all about C++ and Visual Basic. But there's this growing group of people in the middle who make websites. And we don't know what these people are called, because at the time they were just webmasters.
Oh, I haven't heard that in about a decade.
Well, this is 2002.
Oh, how wonderful.
We don't know what they're called. We don't really know what their world view is, but there's definitely a market there. Disappear for 3 months, dream up a brand, dream up a series of books, you know, find out what these people are interested in. So I did that, and that was interesting because that was my first experience of sort of learning about branding, learning about getting into somebody's worldview to see how they think and then to sell stuff to them. And we did well. The parent company went bankrupt, but we met all our targets. So then I actually did a tech lead front-end job for a few years, but all the time I was still interested in the web standards stuff that I discovered while I was running this book company and blogging about it and accessibility, because that's something I'm passionate about, being technically disabled myself. So I was blogging about that stuff because I was having to work on a website that was full of nested tables and spacer GIFs.
Sorry, this is nostalgic in a way that's both beautiful and terrible. Go on.
Yeah, so I was working in that world while blogging about the new world of web standards and accessibility. And I found that level of schizophrenia almost too difficult to bear, you know, because I was coming to work, all these, you know, let's make an API, let's do this. And they're saying, no, can't do, because our CMS costs £200,000 and we can't change it. Yeah, that kind of corporate nonsense. And then I got an email from a guy I'd met at a conference where I was undercover, you know, without my organisational name on the badge. And he worked at Opera, and he said, you know, would you like to come and work for us?
That sounds magical. So you just did what you thought was wonderful and life-affirming, and somebody was like, hey, can we pay you for this?
Well, no, actually, because the job they offered me was, they flew me over to Norway for a weekend of interviews, which actually was kind of me sitting in a room drinking coffee while people wandered in and had a chat, and then took me out and got me drunk in the evenings.
That doesn't sound terrible.
Well, in Norway, the cost of getting somebody drunk is so prohibitive. I realised they were already quite invested in me. But then they offered me this job, which was basically editing articles for their website. And I said, well, I've done editing articles for websites before, and also what you want to achieve isn't achievable by this job. What you want to achieve is some kind of You want greater mind share, and you do that by having a me speaking at conferences, representing the brand, being identified in people's minds as, Mr. Opera, which meant, I used to get lots and lots of weird tweets from people about why doesn't Opera 6 work on my Nokia 3729/J, which I had no idea about. And they said, well, this job doesn't exist. So I said, okay, well, I have a buddy who would like the job you are offering me. Introduced them, he worked for them, and then a year later he contacted me and said, that job that you pitched, and I hadn't really pitched a job, I just said, this is what you need. They said it's available and you're invited to be the only applicant. And I went,
that is not a bad run. To walk you through how I got in, because I wasn't very visible when I started, I faked it. Mm-hmm. So I'd really wanted to go to a conference that I couldn't afford, and found out that if you get a talk accepted, you get a free ticket. So I tried really hard and I wrote a talk, which in hindsight was probably not fantastic. I haven't dared look at the video. I'm very hesitant.
Never look at videos of yourself speak. I never ever do.
We interviewed someone for the podcast earlier who was talking about public speaking, who was very similar on the, you don't need to see your videos.
No, because then you would never speak again. I've watched it myself a couple of times and I can't believe, A, how brummy my accent is, B, how many times I say, and it's so off-putting. I would never watch myself ever again now.
No, like the collective cringe may kill me if I tried to watch it all the way through.
But I knew I could do the DevRel stuff because I was moderately technical. I'd learned HTML and CSS, etc., through kind of osmosis by being in a book company and then commissioning articles and then actually being a front-end tech lead. And I'd been an actor and a musician, and a school teacher, so I wasn't afraid of getting up in front of people and talking. And I know you've been a school teacher.
Yeah, I was going to say that's one of my favorite. Oh dear, how scary. I'll not ask which video. Wow, being a teacher is the piece of my background I find that's been the most useful moving into developer relations.
I found being an actor... Well, being a teacher was useful because I know I have the knack of explaining things, which is, of course, important when you're doing a talk. I was teaching English to kindergarten and primary school kids in Thailand, but I know I can explain and I know I'm reasonably engaging despite my face, which is off-putting, which is why this is a podcast and not a video, gentle listeners. But it was being an actor, I think, that helped me the most because... there's always a time when you're on stage when the hardware dies or the lights go off or something goes wrong, in the same way that when you're an actor on stage, somebody forgets the lines or something happens with a prop and you just have to learn to keep it going. And I think that really helped me a great deal.
So for developer relations, what are sort of the perks? What are the great things about working in DevRel?
For me, the perks were... kind of the same thing as the downsides, but then I'm a tarot card reader and I know that everything contains within it its own opposite anyway. But I was a tarot card reader in Istanbul for a couple of years before, which put me in great stead for DevRel. Anyway, yeah, you travel a lot, which is great because I love traveling and I spent 8 years on the road.
Because 8 years is quite a while. I keep hearing people internally bandy about a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years as the burnout point.
Well, I had 8 years on the road before I settled down, backpacking around Asia, so I knew I liked travelling. A few years ago, I was complaining to a friend, I'm feeling a bit ropey. It was kind of October. I was running a low-grade cold. I don't want to go to Bulgaria tomorrow. And my friend said, shut the fuck. You're going to get on a plane, go to a nice hotel, you're going to talk for 35 minutes, 400 people will applaud you, then loads of people will take you out for nice food, get you slightly drunk and send you back.
Oh, my husband just had to have a similar, yes, what? Where I was like, oh, I've got to pack. And he's like, well, where are you going? I was like, oh, no, it's just Berlin, don't worry. And he came over to gently shake me and be like, just Berlin.
Yeah.
That's not how normal people do things.
Exactly. It's funny because my daughter, who's now 18, and she's going to just pop over to Brussels for the weekend and pop over to Barcelona for a weekend because she's seen me do it. So there's no mystique in it for her. It's not like, oh, you're going to foreign land. Whereas in an earlier incarnation, when I moved from Birmingham to London, quite a few of my Birmingham friends said, I can't visit you in London. It's 90 minutes on the train. It's London. It's terrifying.
Birmingham's version of south of the river.
Exactly. So the travel's great, but it has within it its downside. I did miss lots of my kids' childhoods, but then I could afford to put a roof over their head. So each thing, that's just the way of the world. I get to work from home when I'm not travelling, which is great when you're having a washing machine delivered or if you need to take a kid to a dentist appointment.
Just general human stuff. Like, I have no idea how people who go to offices... I'm not from Britain originally. You might be able to tell by the terrible French accent. Yeah, quite. How do people buy shoes? For our listeners who don't live in Britain, everything closes here at like 6:30, 7 o'clock. I have no idea how people with 9-to-5 office jobs buy anything they need to continue to be human.
Well, this is why the town centre's ghastly and packed on a Saturday, isn't it? Because that's when everybody goes out and does the stuff. I had to travel on a train in rush hour the other day, and I thought, God, I always avoid rush hour trains. And I thought, God, how do people do this twice a day, every day? But then they probably think, how does he get on a plane and then stand up in front of 500 people and do a talk? That doesn't scare me. The stuff that scares me is the logistics. Am I going to miss my flight? Am I going to find my hotel because I'm utterly disorganised and can't organise my way out of a paper bag?
But phones mostly do it for you now.
Phones mostly do it now, but I would kill for a PA, but the money isn't good enough for that. But yeah, the upsides of the travel, that can be a downside. I've met so many fascinating people, particularly with opera, where I was lucky enough to go to places where we had a huge market share. So I had a month-long tour doing guest lectures in universities in India.
Cool.
And on 2 separate occasions, I went to Indonesia for nearly a month and did talks in Indonesian universities. And my cross to bear is that the last gig was the University of Bali.
Oh, how terrible.
So I had to spend a week in Bali, spending £20 a night on my own money.
Poor lamb.
I know. It was so hot in the daytime that I just sat next to the pool under a gazebo, and that's when I started writing that book with Remy Sharp. But
So if you, dear listener, are absolutely sold, you're like, wait, are people complaining about flying to Bali and that's their life? How would you recommend if somebody was really interested in getting into DevRel now? What would you recommend maybe starting with or trying out?
Well, I think very hard about it because the downsides are potentially legion as well. You do travel a lot and it can get tiring. Air travel it's always economy class. It's never glamorous. And it gets progressively less glamorous the more things you're required to take off and the more carcinogenic machines you have to step into in airports. The thing that I found the hardest, and I'm aware this is zeroth world problems, is that you're always on.
That you have to be, that you've got sort of a professional persona. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure about how it is for you, but my professional persona is a slightly nicer, slightly less sweary version of me that has makeup on.
I don't tend to wear a great deal of makeup, but I do try to be nicer and less sweary, but... It's a weird thing. I remember one time it was like the 6th conference in 6 weeks and I was in Munich or something and there was the after party. And of course the organisers are terribly excited because they've been organising this conference all year, but it's my 6th Wednesday night on the trot getting slightly drunk with strangers and answering the same kind of questions. But fortunately the after party was in the same hotel I was staying, so I kind of went to the after party for an hour, went up to my room and had an hour-long bath, then read my book for an hour, then went back down to the after-party. And I don't think anybody noticed I wasn't there. They just thought I had the alcohol capacity of a rhinoceros.
You're a genius.
Yeah. But,
yeah.
But when somebody comes up to you and asks you about the HTML5 picture element and it's 11:30 at night and you're just outside having a cigarette, trying to call your kids or just take a breath, and you don't want to answer because actually you're tired and you just want to go home, you can't say, look, fuck off, because you're representing your company and that would be horribly unprofessional and rude. But there's sometimes when you do just want to turn off. I used to wonder when I started why often at conferences the speakers hang out together. Are they all like a gang of best friends or do they have a better than you mindset? But it isn't actually. It's because you often tend to sit together so you can sit in pretty much abject silence because you all know what it's like to be asked questions a lot, so you don't do it of each other. And that's why often you see the speakers hanging out. That said, I hate it when there's a speakers-only dinner or a speakers-only area of an after-party. And
how weird. I've not seen that. The speakers-only dinner, like speakers' dinners, I'm okay with.
Yeah, but I've been to an after-party where there's like a special speakers area.
That's super weird.
And where it's €100 more on the ticket to be allowed to sit in the speakers area. I really find that quite icky. I probably would have said no. To that invite had I known that. And that's another thing as well, is often you find yourself having to do things because the company needs you to, but you don't particularly want to. Like, I personally would prefer to only speak at conferences that have a code of conduct.
Which is right and just.
But I'm being paid by people. This is no particular employer, but I can absolutely imagine a circumstance in which my employer said, you really have to go to, Fascist Fest in Kazakhstan, and it doesn't have a code of conduct, and you feel uncomfortable with even being in the place. And sorry, Kazakhstani listeners, that was just an example. I have no problem with Kazakhstan, actually. And you might actually not feel morally great about it. I was always a little queasy when I had to go to Russia.
I've not been with work, and that's been gently curated. Nothing against Russia. Like, it seems like a very, very interesting place, but maybe...
I love going to Russia, but, it's by going, am I, supporting Putin's stance on LGBT rights and all the other terrible things that Russia does? But then saying that, I've been to Israel a lot with my new job, and I got emails from people asking me to boycott Israel.
I had an issue last year where I had to have a bit of a conversation with myself about whether or not I was comfortable attending a really fantastic conference in North Carolina. And they had recently had some laws put in place that make life unnecessarily and really difficult for trans people in a really overtly discriminatory way. So having to think about whether or not I was comfortable with that, even though the conference organizers went well out of their way to say, do you know what, the bathroom laws do not apply on these venues, and really wrote into their code of conduct, if you feel uncomfortable at any time, no, not you, not people being assholes, but like, if you lovely people, if folks from diverse backgrounds feel uncomfortable, please let us know. We're here to sort that. And had to sort of do quite a bit of emotional math, and finally decided that, yes, I'll go to North Carolina, quite like North Carolina, but that all of my discretionary spending I would match with donations to local nonprofits.
Well, I had a thing when I was very graciously invited to the first ever developer conference in Tehran.
How cool. I've always wanted to go to Tehran.
Well, first of all, I thought, am I comfortable going to a place where they hang gay people from cranes? I mentioned it on Facebook, and Facebook is a place where it's non-techie family and friends. And my old boss in Thailand, who's well-travelled as well, said, the people are not the government, particularly in somewhere like Iran, where there might be a democratically elected government, but it all has to be rubber-stamped by the theocracy. He said, you go to the States a lot, where they routinely execute black men with low IQs because they couldn't afford decent representation. What makes Tehran so special? And I had a conversation with myself and thought, actually, I'd love to go to Tehran. And yeah, the kind of people who are inviting me to speak about HTML and CSS are almost certainly not rabid homophobes. And in the end, actually, my employers said no for the entirely understandable reason that as the UK embassy had been burnt down, there was no representation for the UK. As I have MS, how would I get any hospital treatment if I needed? And their insurers said no to insuring me to go to a place where our own foreign office says do not visit. So the kind of decision was made for me. But anyway, I'm going to kind of go too far into these moral dilemmas. But that's the downside. You're being paid to represent a company, and sometimes you'll be asked to represent products you don't necessarily believe in. And that's okay. But other times you'll be asked to do things that may conflict to a greater or lesser degree with your own moral code, and then you have to have a think about it.
I wonder if that's not true with most jobs in technology, and a bigger step back, most jobs.
I think it's true with most jobs. And I tend now to the opinion that my old boss gave me, that, you go everywhere you're invited, particularly if it's the kind of place where people want you to boycott, because like with Israel, I replied to the more polite people who emailed me and said, you're not going to like my answer, but here it is. I reserve the right to think for myself. I'm aware that both the Palestinian cause and the Israeli government have state-of-the-art propagandists, and I don't know what to think until I go there. And I reserve the right to visit places and look for myself. So I think apart from, North Korea and apartheid era South Africa, there are a few places that I wouldn't go to Saudi, but that's about it. But if my bosses told me to, I would go.
You'd have me redact that part of the podcast and re-upload it if you did.
No, if my bosses said you lose your job or you go to Saudi, I would go to Saudi. But I would make sure I didn't spend one single penny of my own personal money. However, my bosses, being an Israeli company, are unlikely to send me to Saudi.
Not terribly likely.
Somewhat hypothetical, but so that's kind of one of the downsides, and it's very tiring. Traveling a lot, you always have to be on. If you get stage fright, as I do, it's a constant battle with yourself. It's one of the reasons I do public speaking, because I get stage fright.
Just to challenge yourself.
To challenge myself, yeah. And one of the biggest difficulties I find is imposter syndrome, because you're talking to people who live and breathe technology X, but by nature, when you're doing DevRel, you have to have a very broad purview. You have to understand marketing, organizational imperatives, a little bit of that, a little bit of this. I'm constantly having imposter syndrome of, why am I up on stage talking about this to people who do this for their day job all the time?
And I think that's fantastically calming to hear other people say that they doubt themselves and that they have imposter syndrome issues.
All the time.
Okay, so you, dear listener, are like, well, there are some challenges to this, and you do have to travel all the time, but the upsides are you have to travel all the time. There's a good chance that you're wondering, how on earth can I get a job like this? Bruce, how would you recommend somebody get started?
I don't know, because I got into it in 2008 when, we kind of made up DevRel as we went along in Opera. I don't know how many other organisations had developer relations then. But I think primarily is get active and involved in the kind of communities that you're interested in, because you can't fake sincerity and you can't do the job if you're not genuinely interested in the tech. And you can do that in many ways. I was very lucky because I had a day job and I did this stuff in the evenings, and I wasn't personally responsible for childcare, so I could go travelling. And most European conferences tend to be in school term times. But that was okay for me because I worked and my wife looked after the children. Not everybody's in that situation, of course.
When my work in developer relations got very, very stressful and towards the end involved quite a bit of travel, my husband shifted and became a house husband. Even without kids, just paying the bills, swapping out clean laundry suitcases needed a second person around for.
You do not have to travel all the time. It was the nature of Opera where I had to go to places like India and Indonesia, which is a big travel because it's a long journey and there's big spaces in between the universities to navigate. But, nipping out to Berlin for a couple of days conference may be more manageable. But you have to have a track record. If you apply for a DevRel job and you say, well, I quite like your product, that's all well and good. But either get involved with something open source and commit code, or if you're not a coder, help them design stuff, because all open source software needs somebody to help with the design. Submit talk proposals to local meetups. Local meetups always need a new speaker. And you start with a 10-minute talk about something you're passionate about, and then move up to 15, then to 20 minutes, and make a name for yourself. That's how you get started. So when you do see a developer relations job, you have a track record to show. You can say, here's a video. It doesn't have to be a professionally produced video. Get your friend to hold up a phone camera We're not interested in when we're interviewing in super high production values. We want to see how well you speak and how well you answer questions, not how well your friend held the camera. We don't care how pretty your PowerPoint deck is, because most organizations will have somebody there whose job involves making other people's PowerPoints look decent. We're interested in how well you explain the concepts and how much enthusiasm you bring and the stage presence. That's what we care about.
That's fantastic. I think this might be a really great time to wrap up a wonderful conversation. I'll include in the show notes places you might be able to find jobs with developer relations. There's devrel.net is a fantastic resource and place that you can find job listings, information, articles, and there's also some developer relations conferences. I'll include all of those in the show notes.
There's also a really good weekly email called the Weekly CFP, I believe, and that gives a rundown of all the calls for papers if you're interested in submitting a talk idea. But I'd really encourage you to start locally as well, because standing up in front of people who are in your hometown means you don't have to travel as far. You don't have to travel as far back. It's an easier way of getting into things. And when people know you're local, it's a lot easier for them to invite you back. I would say if you want to start public speaking, think very carefully about how much stuff you do where they don't pay your expenses, etc. There are conferences which are basically money-making ventures, and they will exploit people by asking them to come and speak for free without travel or accommodation being paid. You know, if it's a local meetup that's in a pub where it's free to get in, it's a grassroots thing, I will always go and speak at those if I can, because I like to support the local stuff. But if it's a great big conference that's charging hundreds of pounds to get in, if you choose to go and speak for free because it's building up your own CV, that's your choice. Do it, but don't feel like it's a moral obligation that you have to. And, you know, have a look at yourself and don't sell yourself short.
Another resource I quite like for getting into public speaking and for calls for papers is the Technically Speaking newsletter. I'll include a link to the mailing list in the show notes as well. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you.